Shana Tova. I have such vivid memories and images of my childhood. Certain ones are crystal clear even today. And they return at different times in my life to teach and to reteach. I find in these times they are tapping me on the shoulder with something important to say. As many of you know, I was born in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, but then moved to Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh before I started kindergarten. I still see our apartment building with perfect detail. A 4-flat on Darlington Road between Murray and Shady, between Mellon Bank and Rosen Drugstore. My parents managed the building for my grandfather until his death in 1970. But what strikes me today more than the familiarity of the place is the composition of the people who lived inside the building. As landlords, my family lived on the first floor, with my brother and I sharing a room in the basement. My brother and I were Felix and Oscar. He loved Roberto Clemente. I loved Willie Stargell. He was incredibly neat. I was incredibly messy. And one time, he drew a tape line down the middle of the room, and I wasn't allowed to cross over. But the door to the room was on his side. There were 3 other apartments above us, which my parents rented out. Joyce and Clay Shelby, an African-American couple, lived in apartment number 1. She worked for a media outlet in Pennsylvania. I remember a black and white photo my mom had of us decorating their Christmas tree. They invited us up to decorate their Christmas tree. In the photo, Clay is holding me by my feet upside down, and behind him on the wall is a black and white poster. I remember this poster. I've looked for it everywhere. It said, "Lord, doesn't anybody care?" Those were the 60s. Transformational times. And as a boy of 6, I was fully unaware of what was really happening. Across the hall, in apartment number 2, Bob Martin and Alan Thompson lived. 2 men, 2 gay men, lived together. They were both Carnegie Mellon graduates. They met when they were as undergrads. They worked in the university research labs. And they allowed us to play with some of the really cool toys they had in their apartments. First off, they had the most amazing hi-fi system. And in the middle of the hi-fi system, they had what was called an oscilloscope. I still remember it. And when the music would play, it would dance, and you would be able to see the music kind of depicted on the screen. They worked on the only mainframe computer that Carnegie Mellon had. It was huge, and they would bring us home punch cards, and we would play with the old computer punch cards. And one time, they actually took us down on a trip to see the big mainframe computer at Carnegie Mellon University. And on the top floor, a 3-bedroom apartment, Barry Gordon, Mark Emerson, and Timmy McMillan, they were fraternity boys from Carnegie Mellon. They were Pikes, and they had a fire truck, and they drove around in their fire truck when they were at the fraternity. They were now engineers working for Westinghouse, and when they weren't racing old Volvos, they joined us in driveway basketball games or took us down to the frat house for spring carnival buggy races, and occasionally they would take us down the street to pick up a Minio's pizza. That was my neighborhood in 1969. To be sure, these were times when society was pushing in on itself, and the news often brought unrest and uncertainty. After years of learning, I now know the import and gravity of those times, and yet today, I find myself calling up the lucid images of those 7 people and my family, because we all lived basically together. There was only one laundry room, which was right next to our bedroom in the basement. And all throughout the day and all throughout the night, people would just come traipsing down into the basement to do their laundry, to share the news of the day. Many times we had no idea who we would find sleeping on the big overstuffed chair that was in the living room. But what my 5-year-old, 6-year-old self couldn't really see was that it would come to serve as a guide to navigate the unsettled questions of today. And it would do it through an unlikely return to the life and legacy of another Pittsburgh giant who took that same precious images of our childhood neighborhoods and used them to teach and reteach what our hearts already knew too well. Now don't worry, I'm not putting on a sweater or tennis shoes. But how does the classically trained musician turned Presbyterian minister become nationally known as Mr. Rogers? And how did Fred McFeely Rogers' paths, strangely interconnected decades earlier with my own family and neighborhood, bring him and all of us to life lessons that we just can't ignore today? Because Fred Rogers was also born in Latrobe in 1928. And the seeds of the Mr. Rogers neighborhood of make-believe were planted right alongside those of my own family roots. You see, the McFeelys and the Rogers, McFeely being Fred Rogers' mom's maiden name, the McFeelys and the Rogers families were among the wealthiest families in Latrobe. The pool and library are named for them. Fred was a classmate of my Aunt Babette's, and she would regale us with stories of growing up with Fred Rogers. And the Rogers were very frequent patrons of the very famous Lowenstein's department store that my family owned from 1900 to 1964. And maybe his cardigan sweaters had the Lowenstein label on them. My dad would quip, and I don't remember many jokes that my dad told, but this is one joke that I so vividly remember. He said that when he was little, he played with blocks, wooden blocks. But when Fred Rogers and the Rogers kids were little, they played with bigger blocks. Depot Street to Main Street, First Avenue to Second Avenue, because they owned the entire downtown. When Fred Rogers emerged from his studies of music and ministry, he landed in Pittsburgh. And by the 1960s, he made a very significant life choice that would influence the face of public discourse and the lessons of my own childhood memories forever. By his own admission, Rogers was drawn to children's television not because he found it interesting or inspiring, but because he found the message of what was being broadcast to kids in the 1960s totally unacceptable. His formula for what and how kids should absorb the world through television was simple, actually brilliant. Provide a safe, low-key, easy-to-access place to just be yourself. Talk openly, talk candidly. Be kind, and maybe learn something you hadn't thought of before. That was his blueprint when he began Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on the Pittsburgh National Education Network in February of 1968 with a budget of $30 per episode. And it would remain his premise until the nationally syndicated PBS series ended 33 years later in 2001. But in our family, the lines of real and make-believe were somewhat blurred, as the real Mr. Rogers and some of his TV friends were actually living and working all around us. We regularly walked past Fred Rogers' beautiful home on Beechwood Boulevard, a big white house, on the way to Frick Park. Chef Brockett, one of the regulars on the show, lived on Darlington Road 1 block away. So we would see him cutting his lawn, or we would see him coming in and out of the garage, and we would wave because he was in our neighborhood. Joyce, who lived on apartment number 1, was actually the first African American in the media department at WQED. Family photos that we still have of my brother perfectly matching in his V-neck sweater and his hair perfectly combed and his little golf jacket, and me with my hair cut and a fringed jacket with dirt over my face. Those family pictures that hung in my parents' home until they died, and now they hang in our home. Those 2 pictures were taken by one of the photographers for the show. And when they needed an extra for a special Mr. Rogers episode at the Pittsburgh Zoo, They picked up the phone and they called my brother, whose hair was perfectly combed, and he was on the show. Of course, like kids all over the country, we watched the show. We were captivated and drawn into the universe of characters and Mr. Rogers' thoughtful questions about things that were happening right then and there. Perhaps what Fred Rogers could not have imagined at the outset of this extraordinary journey was how his unassuming but fierce dedication to a code of engagement for kids would lead him and all of us to see how we might handle some of the most difficult social conversations of the time. I often wonder if Rogers at the show's start didn't think of the program as a break from the challenging discourse that was happening all over the country. Counterculture, anger, and protests on campuses and in the streets, 1968, 1969. Yet throughout the 912 television programs and specials that were aired under his name, what developed was just the opposite. Through the open and curious view of the child, Rogers allowed us to talk about some of the issues that were ever present in American life: race, war, disability, divorce, tensions across the generations, just to name a few. The program's first week, imagine the choice to address the Vietnam War with an allegory involving the show's puppet character, that bossy King Friday, who in the very first week decided that to save his kingdom, he was going to build a barbed wire wall around his castle. Rogers was opening up the dialogue for kids, and yes, for adults. What are we fighting for over there? What's really happening? A wall? During the civil rights era, when racists were thwarting efforts to integrate the nation's swimming pools, and it was all over the media, Rogers demonstrated a simple act of kindness by inviting his friend, Officer Clemens, the very first African American to have a regular spot on daytime television, to sit with him, take off his shoes, and cool his feet, together with Mr. Rogers, in the wading pool. And they showed a close-up of their feet together. The news at that exact time was showing swimming pools where blacks and whites weren't allowed to swim together. But Mr. Rogers wanted everyone to know that it was okay to share water with each other. And then Bobby Kennedy was killed. Again, in the first 2 years of the show, Rogers aimed to explain what an assassination was. Bobby was killed on a Wednesday, and he insisted to put together a special that would air on Friday night, knowing that children around the country were going to be watching on Saturday, and they would have questions. Rather than letting those fears fester, he said, you have to level with kids, you have to tell them, you have to help them, you have to explain to them in age-appropriate terms what the bad things in life are. And so he did. The fact that Mr. Rogers dealt with so many aspects of the human condition with ragtag puppets, cheaply built sets, and funny voices is curious enough. But what's even more staggering was that it actually worked. Daniel the Tiger, King Friday, Queen Sarah, Lady Elaine Fairchild, Henrietta Pussycat, Meow Meow Meow, and X the Owl. These characters dealt with pain and fear, and in doing so gave children the means and the tools to do the same. But as I sit here today, what is truly remarkable about this man, known for his cardigan sweaters, his tennis shoes, and his warm smile, was that he became a very unique kind of activist, a gentle activist, embarking on a mission to elevate human dignity at all costs. He made sure his message came through the most unaffected channel, children's television. Who would have thought that this rare brand of communication would have so much to teach us and tell us today? It might really be that simple. Instead of talking down to people, speak directly to them. Take your cues from children who, like all people, have complex feelings. Tackle difficult subjects respecting the special individual in front of you. Because acceptance and sense of community are essential in life. Anything short of this is unacceptable to us as a human race. His brand of activism used a set of tools which maybe we are finding it difficult to surface in today's paradigm. Silence that creates a space to think and engage. A willingness to slow speech down and slow reactions down. I read that the average American speaks 160 to 180 words a minute. Mr. Rogers spoke 120 words a minute on purpose to deal with the confusion, slow things down, emotional honesty and resistance to cynicism. This is how, in his own time, Fred Rogers brought us all an appreciation for so much. Classical music and jazz music through people like Yo-Yo Ma and Yitzhak Perlman who appeared on the show. It was how he came to speak frankly about disability, learning about the effects of polio by talking to Yitzhak Perlman, or how an electric wheelchair works through that YouTube precursor picture, which was on the wall that he would talk to and a video would appear, and how a boy named Jeff feels about sickness and surgery, and how special guests like LeVar Burton taught us that reading is for everyone, and Rita Moreno with her biracial family helped us see that you could be any color, you could be any race, you could be any religion, you could be any gender, you could be any background, you could have any handicap, and there would be a place for you in this community. It was more than just about not passing judgment. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, in it you learned how to take that extra step of celebrating the irreducible integrity, worth, and uniqueness of every human being that you came in contact with, however lonely, frightened, bewildered, or even scorned they felt, because you are special, and you are special, and you are special. It isn't that I'm just nostalgic for those beautiful days of neighborliness, even if I admit that I idealize my own childhood scenarios. But 15 years after his death and 50 years after the show's start, something about Mr. Rogers' gentle activism speaks right to the heart of our moment and our world today. I've seen it in the public's reaction to this summer's new documentary called Won't You Be My Neighbor? David Brooks writes in the New York Times right after it came out, the power in Rogers' radical kindness at a time when public kindness is scarce. It is as if the pressure of living in a time such as ours, we're reminded, oh yes, that's how people can be. Moral elevation gains strength when it's scarce, but there's also something more radical going on. David Brooks writes, Mr. Rogers was a lifelong Republican. His show was an expression of the mainline Protestantism that was once the dominating morality in American life. In the gospel of Fred Rogers, children are superiors in a way that they trust each person, the way they lack guile, the way a child can admit simple vulnerability. The movie and the upcoming planned biopic starring Tom Hanks is gaining momentum because they're holding up the mirror to the basics we are all yearning for and so desperately missing today when we turn on the TV, when we hear, when we see, when we engage. We're missing love, empathy, compassion, and willingness to be a good neighbor, even when others suggest that we can't be or we shouldn't be. I really wonder what episode 913 would look like after Fred Rogers' voice would open with the familiar, would you be mine, could you be mine, won't you be my neighbor? I'm trying to imagine the neighborhood children on the screen. Would they want to know about school shootings? Would they want to know about white supremacy and violence in the streets of Chicago? Or why it's so hard to talk to the people that are hurting us? How many of us would be able to emerge out of our paralysis and find a way to use some of Fred Rogers' activist tools to open up a conversation in this make-believe episode or in the real lives that we're living right now? But gentle activism doesn't come easy. Throughout his life, Fred Rogers deeply questioned whether he was even making enough of an impact, if it all really mattered. This is despite the fact that the show had become a cultural icon and helped raise millions and millions of children. And even though Fred Rogers saved and responded to every single letter that he received, the evidence for success is preserved in detailed archives in the show through family communications, where Hedda Sherapin, the mother of one of our members, has been working side by side with the Rogers family. She's in the movie, and we've invited her to speak here at Am Shalom in this coming year. Rogers, like many of us, just wasn't sure that his efforts could really redirect a country seemingly barreling down in the wrong direction. But for me, regardless of outcomes, it was his firm commitment to process and the courage to never retreat from it that serves as our call to action today. We can practice as Rogers did for each child, slowing down our pace and our volume to make others feel as though we are talking directly to them and they're the most important people in the world. If every conversation could be like that, so much would be better. This is a rare skill that has the power to preempt the caustic media and the passive-aggressive technologies that keep us isolated from each other in our world today. In so many ways, Mr. Rogers is my role model for the perfect adult in today's world, except for the cardigan. He exemplifies how I would like to be, how I wish I could be, but only manage to be once in a great while. Because here's a guy who's always patient, he's loving, he's kind, he's curious, he's gentle, he's so inquisitive, he's so imaginative, he's so accepting, he's so helpful, he's so inclusive, regardless of opposing forces that urge him to engage otherwise. I'm trying so hard to be more like Mr. Rogers. I'm looking for ways to go beyond including only people who are the same and reaching out to those whom I exclude because they are different. I think if we all tried our hand at this gentle activism, we might have the courage to cross into new yards and make new neighbors out of people we fear or we don't understand. After all, isn't that what the High Holy Days are all about? Renewal, the honest conversation with ourselves, with others, moving forward. The obstacles to gentle activism seem pervasive, but so much of what we see creates roadblocks in our minds and in our hearts. A few years before he died, actually a few weeks before he died, in 2003, Mr. Rogers celebrated New Year's Day by serving as the Grand Marshal of the Rose Bowl Parade in Pasadena, California. He rode in the convertible, waving and smiling with his fellow Grand Marshal, a guy named Bill Cosby. All of us who grew up with Mr. Rogers also grew up as Cosby kids. As we watched another father figure in a sweater, another lofty-minded educator whose children's show Fat Albert opened our eyes to social truths. He was a man we felt that we could trust with our lives. And after a year, this past year of Me Too exposés, plenty of heroes have taken a fall. Fred Rogers isn't one of them. Because the optimism that he built in his life is the optimism that I cling to today. I'm saying to you what was said to Fred at a very young age that he often quoted. He would say, when I was a boy and I would look and see scary things in the news, my mother would always say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. To this day, I'm always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. And so I'm urging all of us to remind ourselves as Fred's own reference to our greatest Jewish value. Right after September 11th, in the ongoing struggle to overcome evil, he talked about the precedent of tikkun olam when he said, we are all called to be tikkun olam. We're all called to be repairers of creation to your neighbor and to yourself. And through his example, we can infuse repair and dignity when we see disgraceful behavior. We can slow down and turn around conversations that incentivize divisiveness. We can use his unusual brand of gentle to fight for the neighborhood that is so fragile today. I see this motivation in the army of ordinary folks who have shown up at airports to welcome our refugee families, who feed the hungry, who work in the community garden, who give endlessly of their time and talent, one person at a time here in Shalom's neighborhood. I so vividly hear Fred Rogers' voice, crystal clear, in my head.
I'm just so proud of all of you who have grown up with us. And I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead. But I would like to tell you what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are. And what's more, I'm so grateful to you for helping the children in your life to know that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe and to help them express their feelings in ways that will bring healing in many different neighborhoods. It's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends.
And so after 5 years in Pittsburgh, my dad was transferred. And we had to leave Squirrel Hill and our little neighborhood of real and make-believe. And you know, I've lived in a lot of places since then. But I don't think anything was quite like 5856 Darlington Road. Sadly, I was never able to ask my parents how they came to create such an unusual blend of families for that brief moment in time in our apartment building, or whether this was their own unique brand of gentle activism. But today, those scenes from my childhood march right alongside the vision I think Fred Rogers had for every neighborhood and every neighbor. And like him, I hope we can all go forward, unwilling to accept anything less. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will. Amen.